Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping into what our source calls a shadow history. It's a story that isn't always taught about how entire identities can be taken apart, piece by piece, not with a sudden crash, but with a quiet, careful architectural plan. Okay, let's start with this quote because it really gets to the heart of the matter. The idea here is that erasure isn't always as loud and obvious as, burning books. Sometimes it's much more subtle. It can happen by relocating people, by renaming them, and by controlling who gets to tell the story. And this is a key point. We're not just talking about migration here. The source frames this as a history of deliberate, forced distance, a calculated separation from your homeland, from the language you speak, and from the collective memory that makes you who you are. This is the shadow history we're digging into. So how was this actually done? Well, it certainly wasn't an accident. This was a calculated project, an architecture of forced identity shifts, all designed for a very specific purpose. It all began here, over 12 million people. The transatlantic slave trade was the foundation. But it's absolutely crucial to understand that this analysis points to something much bigger than just an economic system for labor. No, it was an identity project from the very start. And here is the blueprint. It's just devastatingly methodical when you lay it out like this. It wasn't just one thing, it was a whole system. You replace personal names, you forbid native languages, you criminalize spiritual beliefs, you intentionally break apart families and communities, and then the final step, you rewrite history itself so that it begins not in Africa, but with enslavement. So you have to ask, why? Why go through all this trouble? The goal was simple. Disconnection. The source suggests that a person who is cut off from their roots, their history, their community, well, they become easier to govern, easier to control, and much, much harder to unify. And this slide really nails the strategy. Think about it. If you keep your identity as Yoruba or Mande, you have a connection to a specific land, a specific history, a government. But instead, a new artificial category was forced on people. Black. It's a broad label designed to erase those specific nations and create that disconnection we were just talking about. Okay, so eventually the legal chains were broken. But what happened next? Let's jump to the period right after slavery and see how this whole architecture of disconnection was kept in place. Emancipation ended the legal status of slavery, sure, but just look at this comparison. It did not restore what was taken, what was offered, legal freedom, what was withheld, land, political power, economic repair, sovereignty. The source calls this freedom without repair. This left the diaspora in this kind of limbo. As the quote powerfully puts it, a people everywhere, yet anchored nowhere. You're not quite African in a political sense anymore because the continent itself was being colonized, but you're also not accepted as an equal in the Western nations where you now live. Being anchored nowhere brings up a really critical question, doesn't it? What about trying to reconnect, to repair that break? What about trying to return to Africa? And believe me, there were powerful attempts. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, huge movements and congresses popped up. You had figures like Marcus Garvey, who had this radical vision of a globally unified African people with their own economy and their own political power. But that vision, a reconnected, sovereign diaspora, that was seen as a direct threat to the global power structure at the time. So these movements were systematically taken apart. Leaders were targeted, migration was blocked by law, and colonial powers made sure there was nowhere sovereign for them to be received. And this is such a key distinction. Preventing that reconnection was just as deliberate as the initial disconnection. The door back wasn't just closed, it was actively guarded. So, let's fast forward. How do the echoes of this history, this guarded door, show up on the global stage today? The source asks a really direct question, and it's one we should all think about. In our world of 24/7 media, think about the images you see of global power, G7 summits, the UN Security Council. How often are African leaders there as the architects of policy, and not just the subjects of it? This table just lays it out so clearly. In areas like entertainment and sports, Black and African visibility is high. But when you look at the arenas where the big global decisions get made, policy, finance, that visibility just canks. And decision-making power, it's low across the board. The source has a name for this: containment. Containment. It's a slicker, more modern form of erasure. It's about letting someone be seen in certain spaces, which creates this illusion of inclusion while making sure that presence doesn't actually translate to authority. You're a symbol, not a strategist. You have a seat at the table, but you have no say in what's on the menu.
So this brings us to the end of our explainer, but this isn't really a story with a neat conclusion. Instead, the source argues the real work is in wrestling with the urgent, unfinished questions this history leaves behind.
The first question is all about power. Who actually benefits from keeping this history in pieces? You really have to ask who gains, politically and economically, from a disconnected African world.
Next, we have to look at the systems themselves. Who are the gatekeepers? Who gets to decide which voices from the continent and the diaspora are considered legitimate and get a platform, and which ones are just ignored?
And this might be the most challenging question of all. It asks us to imagine a future where the story isn't framed by outside forces or old constraints. What would it look like for that narrative to be told on its own terms, without asking anyone for permission first? And the source leaves us with this final thought. The very fact that this deep historical shadow exists, well, that proves that there's a brilliant light, a true, powerful identity that was worth all the effort to try and erase, and an identity that, once remembered, isn't so easily forgotten again.